Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of CoinNewsExtra interview session. It's a program where we invite innovators, influencers, and stakeholders in the blockchain, crypto, and fintech space to come air their point and matters arising in the ecosystem. So today I have with me a great innovator in the ecosystem. I have Rob McNealy. Rob, you're welcome to CoinNewsExtra.
Hey, thank you for having me. How are you today?
Yeah, you're doing great. Rob is the co-founder of Tusk. So, Rob, how is the United States today?
Oh, politically things are a little kind of chaotic, I would say, with the election and everything. But in general, and the pandemic, and yeah, actually, things kind of suck, I guess. But things are going really well for us. So the project is really on track, and things are pretty good. So in spite of 2020 being kind of a challenging year for a lot of Americans, I think we'll get through all this. We've been through bad things before as a country, and we'll come out of this pretty strong afterward.
Yeah, that's our prayer that this will be over very soon. So we'll be looking at blockchain for startup acceleration. So we want to see how blockchain is going to play a role in this when it comes to businesses and startup. So, but before we go to that topic, can you just give us a brief about yourself and your background?
Sure. So Tusk is a delegated proof of stake blockchain, and our use case that we're trying to solve initially is adoption. So one of the things that are out there with a lot of blockchains is that everybody has created these great speculative assets. But really, even none of the big projects have really figured out how to get people to use their crypto. And I think in the West, and I think the reason for that in the West is that we don't really have a problem with payments like they do in a lot of other countries. So getting people to use blockchain and crypto payments for things is very challenging because it actually creates more work than, say, just using standard PayPal or Stripe or Venmo. But I think what we're doing that's a little different as a project, even though we are a decentralized project, we're kind of focused on just one market that has a recognized payments problem in the United States, and that's a big industry in the U.S. lawful gun industry. So we're focused on the gun industry in the United States as our initial market where we're trying to get adoption.
Interesting. That's very nice. The project is moving fine and finding a niche in this space. So let's look at, when we talk about startups, it's about businesses. So with lots of startup acceleration programs going on, how can startup leverage blockchain technology?
Well, I think that could happen. That's a big, broad, loaded question, right? Like, I think ultimately it depends on what your goal is. If you think about blockchains are just transparent, open ledgers, basically decentralized databases. And so blockchain technology theoretically can be used in a lot of applications that, a database might be used. As far as startups, what would you do? Well, ultimately, this is like the entrepreneurs, the whole big entrepreneur dilemma, right? Is what do you do if you want to start a business, but where do you start? I would say, look at starting if you're going to start a business, I always say you need to be solving a problem and you should have a customer in mind before you ever start. So if you have someone who has a problem that a blockchain can solve, then you go to that person or that company or that industry that has this problem and get them involved in the process before you ever start coding, before you ever start your business, and present to them the solution that you're proposing for them. And I think if you work backwards that way, instead of what traditional developers, coders, and entrepreneurs do, is they do the build it, they will come, where they just develop something, they think there's a market for it, and then they throw it out there and hope that people use it. And I think that's backwards, and I think it's not effective. So I think come up with find someone who has a problem that a blockchain solves, and then go to them and think of them as a customer. And if you can solve their problem with blockchain, build your company or build your project around that relationship, and then it may work for other people, and then you grow it outward from there.
Interesting. That's very nice. There are these things that normally happen. People are not going for what is solving the problem. Just build the project and come out immediately thinking that people will come after it. So that's a very nice one from you. So we are looking, what areas, what some of the areas startups can apply blockchain. And another thing in this question is, people are looking at that when you talk about blockchain, is the only tech companies or projects that can apply blockchain. So, what are some other areas startup can leverage blockchain technology?
So that's an interesting question, because I would have to ask you a question of where are you talking? Because I think different places have different needs. I do know of some interesting projects going on that I think blockchain could help solve some problems around land ownership. So, and I know a lot of places, especially in developing nations, where the ownership of land is in question, where people don't know who really owns something or doesn't. And that's a really fundamental problem when you're trying to build things, when you're trying to put in farms, when you're trying to have assets that go from one generation to another when, say, a family member dies. And I think that in the West, we don't really have a problem with that. For instance, for the most part, land records are on databases. We have really good record keeping. But in a lot of other places, especially areas where maybe there's tribes involved in things, I think land records could be one of those areas that blockchain could solve very readily the ownership question, and especially in some developing nations, which I think would help in a lot of ways, business and growth.
Yeah, that's very nice. Most especially African countries. There are issues with data record keeping. So we believe blockchain will play a major role there. So lastly, before we draw the curtain on today's episode of Coin News Extra interview session, so seeing that internet enhanced business activities and brought about globalization, do you think blockchain and cryptocurrency can do more about that?
As far as growing business, absolutely. So,
Yes, and connecting the world.
sure. I think if you look at, how the internet was rolled out. Now, I'm probably 2 to 3 times your age. So I remember I was living in Europe in the late 90s. And we already had internet access starting in the early 90s in the United States. But yet internet access was very new, even in Europe in the late 90s. But what we saw is that in Europe and in some Asian countries, internet adoption got really, really, what drove internet adoption was mobile devices and cell phones. And so if you look at the widespread usage of cell phones in Europe and Asia and probably Africa was largely driven by trying to get internet access, because the physical landlines were very challenging to put in Asia and in a lot of European countries versus putting it in here in the United States. So in the United States, we had cable. Cable television was really widespread because it was really easy to put in the cables, the both from the regulatory standpoint, the easements that were already in place for utilities in many places across the country, and just the infrastructure was just easy to put in. And so because of that existing cable television infrastructure, our internet access really was driven by cable, not cell phones. So cell phone penetration in the United States lags even today a lot of places in Europe and Asia, because what drove cell phone adoption in those places was internet access, because they didn't have the landline infrastructure. So let's look at cryptocurrencies. So look at access to banking and other financing things, right? So in a lot of places in developing nations, what you see is there's a lack of access to capital and funding and basic banking services. And part of that's given that there's a lack of brick and mortar buildings. There's a lack of, the network, trusted networks. And there's my understanding, your problems better than I would, but, identification can be a problem as well in a lot of places. People just don't have IDs that, they can get to using, the Western banking system. So I think much like cell phone technology was driven and cell phone penetration was driven by trying to get access to the internet, I think what you're going to see is, I think the bigger markets for cryptocurrencies being used for buying and selling goods and services will probably flourish in third world and developing nations. That the West doesn't. And they have lack of infrastructure out there with normal payment methods. And so I think the developing nations are ripe for opportunity for people to really get adoption with crypto payments, because they already have the cell phone technology penetration, as I just mentioned, that already exists, but they don't have the banking infrastructure that the West does. So, for instance, that's why I say in the West, we're focused only on a couple industries in the United States that have a recognized problem with payments.
Hello. So,
Where did I leave you? Looks like I lost you.
yeah, you are talking about how internet is going to be, cryptocurrency adoption is going to be driven by lack of banking infrastructure in developing countries.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is that due to the lack of banking infrastructure in developing nations, but the high level of penetration of cell phone networks in those developing nations, I think that cryptocurrencies as a payment rail is probably going to take off in the developing nations first, probably more so than the Western nations, just because we already have plenty of options for payments in the West now, and crypto doesn't solve that. They don't solve any problem for most people in the West. So I do think that there's a tremendous opportunity in developing nations for these payment rails based on crypto and blockchain.
Interesting. What role is Tusk playing in the ecosystem when it comes to adoption?
So we're just another crypto payment project, but we were purpose built for payments. We weren't built just to be a token out there that, hopefully moons and then the team bails out. That was never why we built it. We built Tusk to be used as a payment option, as a payment rail. But we just said, one of the things that we're doing a little differently is marketing. We want to reach out to an industry that we feel has a recognized problem with payments in the West, and this is a big enough industry. It's a big industry. The main industry we're focused on initially of introducing crypto payments to is the U.S. gun industry, which is a $50 billion a year industry. And so we're just focused on, showing and introducing an industry that crypto can help, and holding their hand and getting them to work with it.
Interesting. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful time with you, Rob McNealy, co-founder Tusk. Thank you very much for joining us today on CoinNewsExtra.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And if anybody's interested in learning more, they can just go to TUSC.network. That's TUSC.network, TUSC.network.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.